HESI A2 Biology Active and Passive Transport. Question 1. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. In a compost ecosystem, individuals with an inherited trait survive drought more often and produce more offspring. Over many generations, what is the most likely population minus level result? Option A. The population immediately becomes a different species. Option B. The environment directly writes the same mutation into all organisms. Option C. Every individual develops the trait by need. Option D. The allele associated with the trait becomes more common. The correct answer is option D. The allele associated with the trait becomes more common. Heritable variation causes individuals to differ in survival and reproduction under environmental pressure. Those with an advantageous trait contribute more copies of the associated allele to later generations. The change occurs in the population's allele frequencies rather than through purposeful modification by individuals. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 2. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. Which observation from a compost ecosystem is the best example of an adaptation rather than a short term acclimation? Option A. An animal learns a route during its lifetime. Option B. An individual temporarily breathes faster at high altitude. Option C. A plant wilts during one hot afternoon. Option D. A heritable feature has become common because it improved reproduction across generations. The correct answer is option D. A heritable feature has become common because it improved reproduction across generations. An evolutionary adaptation is an inherited population minus level feature shaped over generations. Temporary physiological adjustments and learned behaviors can help an individual respond, but they are not inherited genetic changes. The distinction depends on heritability and generational change. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 3. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. One diploid cell from a compost ecosystem completes meiosis without error. Which outcome is expected? Option A. One diploid cell with twice as many chromosomes. Option B. For genetically identical diploid cells. Option C. For haploid cells with genetic differences. Option D. Two identical diploid cells. The correct answer is option C. For haploid cells with genetic differences. Two successive nuclear divisions follow one round of DNA replication. Homologous chromosomes separate first, and sister chromatids separate in the second division. Crossing over and independent assortment contribute to variation among the resulting haploid cells. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Stressed about your HESI A2 exam? We can take HESI A2 exam for you remotely and undetected. We always guarantee a pass and payments only after results. To send us an email, scan the code or tap the link in the description and let's get it done. Question 4. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. Which source creates new heritable variation in a population studied during a compost ecosystem? Option A. Mutation in DNA that enters the reproductive lineage. Option B. Temporary change in body temperature. Option C. Identical mitotic copying without error. Option D. Use of a trait during an individual's lifetime. The correct answer is option A. Mutation in DNA that enters the reproductive lineage. A change in genetic sequence can create a new allele when it occurs in cells that contribute to offspring. Recombination rearranges existing alleles, while mutation can introduce a novel version. Temporary physiological changes are not transmitted as DNA sequence changes. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 5. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. Cells in a compost ecosystem join small subunits into a larger biological polymer while releasing water. Which reaction type is occurring? Option A. Ionization. Option B. Hydrolysis. Option C. Dehydration synthesis. Option D. Neutralization only. The correct answer is option C. Dehydration synthesis. Building a polymer commonly removes a hydrogen from one subunit and a hydroxyl group from another. The removed parts form water while a new covalent bond links the subunits. The reverse reaction uses water to split the bond. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 6. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. A membrane in a compost ecosystem separates 78 freely permeable particles on one side from 22 on the other. Before equilibrium, which direction describes the net particle movement? Option A. From the higher minus concentration side toward the lower minus concentration side. Option B. Only toward the side containing larger molecules. Option C, equally in one direction until all particles stop moving. Option D, from the lower minus concentration side toward the higher minus concentration side using ADP. The correct answer is option A, from the higher minus concentration side toward the lower minus concentration side. Random molecular motion produces a net flux down a concentration gradient. Movement continues in both directions, but more particles leave the crowded side than return to it. At equilibrium, motion continues even though net transfer becomes zero. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 7. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. An organism in a compost ecosystem displays a recessive flower pigment under complete dominance. Which genotype must it have? Option A BB, Option B BB, Option C BBB, Option D BB. The correct answer is option A, BB. A dominant allele masks the recessive allele in a heterozygote. Expression of the recessive phenotype therefore requires two recessive copies. The observable trait alone cannot distinguish the two dominant minus phenotype genotypes. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 8. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. Two heterozygous organisms in a compost ecosystem are crossed for flower pigment, with B dominant to B. Which probability describes an offspring with the recessive phenotype? Option A 0%, Option B 75%, Option C 50%, Option D 25%. The correct answer is option D, 25%. Each parent can contribute either allele with equal probability. Combining the gametes produces one homozygous recessive outcome among four equally likely genotype combinations. Only that genotype expresses the recessive phenotype under complete dominance. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Are you looking for HESI A2 exam actual questions? Visit our website pokerexams.com to access HESI A2 exam study guide with actual questions and answers. Scan the QR code or click the link in the description to get HESI A2 exam answer key today. Question 9. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. A researcher examining a compost ecosystem identifies a molecule whose main role is long minus term energy storage and membrane formation. Which class best matches that role? Option A minerals, Option B carbohydrates, Option C lipids, Option D nucleic acids. The correct answer is option C, lipids. Hydrophobic molecules store substantial energy and form the main structural framework of cell membranes. Their nonpolar nature also makes them useful for insulation and waterproofing. Sugars are more commonly used for readily accessible energy. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 10. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. A specimen from a compost ecosystem has a rigid cellulose wall and chloroplasts. Which cell type is most consistent with those traits? Option A bacterial cell, Option B plant cell, Option C animal cell, Option D virus particle. The correct answer is option B, plant cell. A cellulose boundary and photosynthetic organelles identify a photosynthetic eukaryotic cell. Animal cells lack both structures. Bacteria may have walls, but their walls are not cellulose and they do not contain membrane-bound chloroplasts. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 11. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. Consider the food chain grass, grasshopper, frog, hawk in a compost ecosystem. Which organism occupies the primary consumer level? Option A grasshopper, Option B grass, Option C frog, Option D hawk. The correct answer is option A, grasshopper. Primary consumers obtain energy by feeding directly on producers. The next consumer eats the primary consumer, and higher levels continue the transfer. Identifying the feeding relationship is more useful than relying only on an organism size. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 12. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. A researcher conducting a compost ecosystem changes temperature and records germination percentage each day. Which factor is the dependent variable? Option A temperature, Option B germination percentage, Option C the researcher's name, Option D the hypothesis wording. The correct answer is option B, germination percentage. The dependent variable is the outcome measured in response to an experimental change. Its values are compared across treatment levels or groups. The manipulated factor is the independent variable rather than the measured response. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 13. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. Organisms in a compost ecosystem need a rapidly available source of chemical energy. Which class of biological molecule is most directly used for this purpose? Option A, steroid hormones. Option B, mineral salts. Option C, nucleic acids. Option D, carbohydrates. The correct answer is option D, carbohydrates. Sugars can be broken down readily during cellular respiration to release energy for ADP production. They also serve in short-term storage and structural roles in some organisms. Genetic polymers and inorganic ions do not serve as the usual immediate fuel reserve. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 14. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. During a compost ecosystem, cells synthesize a protein. Which smaller unit is repeatedly joined to build this molecule? Option A, nucleotide. Option B, monosaccharide. Option C, amino acid. Option D, fatty acid only. The correct answer is option C, amino acid. Polypeptides are assembled from small units containing amino and carboxyl groups. Peptide bonds connect the units into chains that later fold. Sugars and nucleotides build different classes of biological polymers. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 15. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. During a compost ecosystem, a mucus-secreting epithelial cell loses its ability to carry out protein modification and sorting. Which cellular structure is most directly affected? Option A, ribosome. Option B, Golgi apparatus. Option C, mitochondrion. Option D, lysosome. The correct answer is option B, Golgi apparatus. Newly made proteins are modified, labeled, and directed toward their destinations. The described failure therefore points to the compartment specialized for that work. Other organelles may support the cell, but they do not perform this immediate task. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 16. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. During a compost ecosystem, one group receives the experimental treatment and another is kept under normal conditions. Why is the normal group included? Option A. It provides a baseline for comparison. Option B. It guarantees the hypothesis is correct. Option C. It increases the treatment dose. Option D. It removes the need for repeated trials. The correct answer is option A. It provides a baseline for comparison. A comparison group shows what happens without the tested treatment under otherwise similar conditions. Differences between groups can then be associated more confidently with the manipulated factor. A control does not eliminate all uncertainty or replace replication. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 17. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. A dividing cell in a compost ecosystem shows that chromosomes condense and a spindle begins forming. Which mitotic stage is shown? Option A, metaphase. Option B, prophase. Option C, anaphase. Option D, telophase. The correct answer is option B, prophase. Chromatin becomes visibly compact and division machinery begins organizing at the start of nuclear division. The nuclear envelope also begins to break down in many cells. Alignment and separation occur in later stages. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 18. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. In a compost ecosystem, a microscopic cell is observed to contain a membrane-bound nucleus. Which broad cell type best matches this observation? Option A, prokaryotic cell. Option B, eukaryotic cell. Option C, protein complex. Option D, virus particle. The correct answer is option B, eukaryotic cell. A membrane-enclosed nucleus and internal membrane compartments are defining features of eukaryotic organization. Bacteria and archaea lack these membrane-bound structures. Viruses are not cells and cannot carry out independent cellular metabolism. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Stressed about your HESI A2 exam? We can take HESI A2 exam for you remotely and undetected. We always guarantee a pass and payments only after results. To send us an email, scan the code or tap the link in the description and let's get it done. Question 19. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. In a compost ecosystem, allele B is dominant for a flower pigment. Which genotype is homozygous dominant? Option A, BB. Option B BB, Option C BB, Option D B. The correct answer is option C, BB. A homozygous genotype contains two copies of the same allele. When both copies are the dominant form, the dominant phenotype is expressed and no recessive allele is present. A heterozygote contains one of each allele. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 20. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. A cell in a compost ecosystem contains 13% non-penetrating solute and is placed in a solution containing 12% non-penetrating solute. Which outcome is most likely? Option A. Water leaves the cell, causing it to shrink. Option B. Solute enters by osmosis and lowers cell volume. Option C. The concentrations prevent all molecular motion. Option D. Water enters the cell, causing it to swell. The correct answer is option D. Water enters the cell, causing it to swell. A higher solute concentration inside the cell creates a net movement of water inward through the selectively permeable membrane. The added water increases cell volume. Solute movement is not what defines this water-minus-balancing process. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 21. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. During meiosis in a compost ecosystem, homologous chromosomes exchange matching DNA segments. Which effect can this event have on offspring? Option A. It converts RNA into DNA in every cell. Option B. It always doubles chromosome number. Option C. It prevents all genetic variation. Option D. It creates new combinations of alleles on chromosomes. The correct answer is option D. It creates new combinations of alleles on chromosomes. Exchange between homologous chromatids produces chromosomes containing maternal and paternal segments in new arrangements. Gametes can therefore carry allele combinations not found together on either original homologue. The process increases variation without normally changing chromosome number. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 22. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. A diploid organism studied in a compost ecosystem has 16 chromosomes in a somatic cell. How many chromosomes should a normal gamete contain? Option A, 16. Option B, 32, option C, 8, option D, 7. The correct answer is option C, 8. Meiosis reduces chromosome number by half, so fertilization can restore the diploid condition. Each gamete receives one member of every homologous pair. The calculation uses the haploid number rather than the number of chromatids present during replication. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 23. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. A heterozygous organism from a compost ecosystem is crossed with a homozygous recessive organism for flower pigment. What fraction of the offspring is expected to show the dominant phenotype? Option A, 1/4, option B, 1/2, option C, 1, option D, 0. The correct answer is option B, 1/2. The heterozygous parent produces dominant and recessive gametes in equal proportions, while the recessive parent contributes only the recessive allele. Half the combinations are heterozygous and express the dominant trait. The remaining combinations are homozygous recessive. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 24. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. In a compost ecosystem, a researcher changes temperature and measures germination percentage. Which factor is the independent variable? Option A, temperature. Option B, the final conclusion. Option C, germination percentage. Option D, the number written on the data table. The correct answer is option A, temperature. The independent variable is deliberately manipulated to test its effect. The measured response is the dependent variable. A clear experiment changes one main factor while keeping other relevant conditions as constant as possible. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting. Question 25. Temperature, moisture, and organism activity are recorded throughout decomposition. In cells observed during a compost ecosystem, the cell grows and performs routine metabolism before DNA synthesis. Which cell-cycle stage is being described? Option A, G1 phase, option B, HESI phase, option C, metaphase, option D, cytokinesis. The correct answer is option A, G1 phase. Cells usually increase in size, produce proteins, and carry out normal functions before copying their chromosomes. DNA replication has not yet occurred at this stage. A checkpoint helps determine whether conditions favor entry into the synthesis phase. The evidence from a compost ecosystem applies this principle in a concrete biological setting.